Hey there, welcome back to our channel. Today we are diving into chapter 51 of our G-Waves series, and we are going to explore some fascinating aspects of how our brains process information and shape our reactions. So, let's get started. You've made it through 50 chapters. Congrats! But have you found yourself with more questions than answers? That's actually a good thing. It's all about that journey of learning and questioning. Let's tackle a simple one. Why do we react differently when we see someone else for versus when we for ourselves? Some might say it's because the sensory input G waves are different, and they are right. But how exactly are they different? Is it just that the G waves are closer, more specific, and stronger when we experience something firsthand? Let's switch up the examples. Why do we react differently when we hear about someone else losing money in the stock market versus when it's our own money? Or when someone else fails an exam versus when we fail? And what if it's not just anyone else, but a loved one? Our reactions change again. So, why is that? That's the key question why we are going to analyze. The same person can have different reactions to losing money myself and someone else losing money. This means there is difference in the reaction patterns, and thus the activated G waves are different. So, what's different about the activated G waves? Let's break down these two types of sensory input G waves. Both contain the characteristic structure of losing money. So, where do they differ? What other characteristic structures do they contain? I bet you can easily reason this out. One is the characteristic structure of self, and the other is the characteristic structure of others. That's the difference between these two sensory G waves inputs. After these two G waves inputs activate different G waves, we can broadly and simply consider cons- consider one as the self losing money G and the other as the others losing money G. Both of these G waves undoubtedly have the same sub-G of losing money, but their other sub-Gs are different. One is about the self, and the other is about others, and we simply call them the self-G and the others G. Of course, this is just for easy analysis. The others G can be further divided. Otherwise, we wouldn't have different reactions to friends, enemies, and strangers. So, how is the others G formed? Naturally, it's established and reshaped through long-term cognition in the social environment. But here, we should focus more on other key term, the self-G. Similar to the others G, the self-G also contains the cognition of the self. However, this cognition is a bit more complex. It's not only reshaped by the individual in the environment through sensory G waves input, but also forms extensive G connections with various cognitive G waves of approach and avoidance, as well as behavior G waves. In other words, this G is coupled with multiple pleasure subdues and discomfort subdues. In the Euro-awake state, this G is an activated state, manifesting as the state of self-perception. In the discussions of the previous 50 chapters, we've assumed that this G is in an activated state. The reason we're only now, the reason we're only now seriously mentioning is that we didn't want to increase the difficulty for everyone too early. So, when is this self-G generated? First, it must based on the material uh, existence of neuron tissues, even if its anatom- anatomical position is fixed as an instinctive G that can participate in inheritance. Its existence must be later than the appearance of embryonic in neuron tissue. Second, its development and growth must rely on the input of sensory G waves, and sensory G waves depend on the establishment of a relatively complete nervous system. Third, as the individual grows, this G relies on the continuous input of sensory G waves and couples with some cognitive G waves closely related to itself, such as cognitive G waves about its own organs and behaviors. With further development, it may also couple with other cognitive G waves, such as those about names, kinship, factions, reputations, interests, regions, idols, and so on. In Pavlov's dog experiment, the bell activates the dog's foot G. For the foot G to activate its pleasure sub-G, it must first combine to produce the simulated G waves of eating that food. To combine these simulated G waves and activate the pleasure sub-G, the self-G must be activated. Otherwise, there would be no characteristic structure about the self, and the pleasure sub-G couldn't be activated. Therefore, here we boldly infer: if the sensory G waves input can eventually activate the corresponding pleasure or discomfort sub-G, thereby forming the corresponding emotion or behavior, the self-G must be activated first. In other words, the self-G is a key hub in the path of G waves transmission to the pleasure or discomfort sub-G. Let's verify this inference with various behaviors in daily life. Seeing someone else fall doesn't significantly activate the self-G through the characteristic structure of the sensory G waves input, so not much discomfort is produced. Seeing someone else make money in the stock market similarly doesn't significantly activate the self-G, so not much pleasure is produced either. But why do we feel discomfort when we see a loved one fall and feel happy when we see a loved one make money in the stock market? Because after the characteristic structure of a loved one is input, it activates the cognitive G about the loved one. And this cognitive G is strongly coupled with the self G. Usually, the closeness of a relationship reflects the strength and stability of the coupling. The more distant the relationship, the less it can indirectly activate the self-view, and the less it can resonate deeply. This inference seems particularly important as if it allows us to see the light through the clouds, but new questions arise. For example, why do we feel pleased when we see our competitors fail, and even feel a strong dislike when we see them benefit? How should explain this explanation? How should we explain these reactions? We will solve this problem afterwards. Okay, that's all the content today. See you next time. Bye bye.